Hello and welcome. It's the 3rd of September, and this is the 18th episode of Thursdays with Charlie. Really glad to have you back with us, and hopefully you'll enjoy our little show today. I have to tell you, there have been several sightings of Pascal, our parish owl. He's been around the property, not in his usual spot by the church office. I think the construction is keeping him away from there, but he's been spotted at various points around the parking lot and actually in the neighborhood as well. So he is in the area, and we're going to be ready to welcome him back, hopefully to his usual perch outside our offices. Again, I have to thank everybody, as I have for the past several weeks, for putting up with the reservation system. Since we're limited to only 50 people at a religious service, at our masses, we have to use the reservation system. And you've been very good about it, calling in on Thursdays and Fridays between 9 and 3, talking with a real person, who's our secretary, Juanita, 702-298-0440, and making a reservation. We've had just about 50 people at each of the masses, except for the 12 where we've been in the high 30s. And so that's usually got some openings. But please keep doing it. It looks like we're going to have to continue doing that for quite some time to come. And also, I remind you that the Bishop, George Leo Thomas, has continued his dispensation from the obligation to attend Mass through the last weekend of September. I don't know if it'll be renewed after that, but for Catholics living in the Diocese of Las Vegas or visiting in the Diocese of Las Vegas, there is no obligation to attend Mass in person through the end of September, and that will probably be reviewed as we get closer to that date. For now, though, we still have the 50 people per Mass. We're using the reservation system, and it seems to be working as well as possible. You might recall last week's show I did a number of religious acronyms, and I asked if anybody had any others to please forward them to me, and I did receive several of them. A few I'd like to just mention today. Fish, F-I-S-H, fish. First I seek help. Fish, first I seek help. A good reminder of the importance of prayer and going to God first. He should never be our last resort. He should be our first line of defense. And then a very simple one, dog, D-O-G. Depend on God. Certainly we get to see enough dogs around, whether we're walking outside or looking on TV. We get to see them, and it can be a wonderful reminder for prayer. Depend on God when we see a dog around the area. And then SNAP, S-N-A-P. Stop now and pray. Stop now and pray. I'm sure there are many, many others, and we're going to use them as we find them and be glad to share them with you. Those of you who were either at our in-person Masses this past weekend or who watched our virtual Mass know that I was able to display this wonderful green bear, the bright lime green. And I mentioned the story behind it, that one of our ushers, a longtime usher, Ron Finn, had worn this bright green jacket at church very frequently. Of course, obviously on St. Patrick's Day weekend, but he wore it other times too. And it was always bright and beautiful and noticeable. And Ron died a year or so ago, and his wife Lucille had 2 of these bears made from his jacket. She kept one, and I got the other one because I love that jacket. I get to comment on it, and I think this bear will always be a great reminder for me and for our whole parish of all the wonderful people who work to make St. John the Baptist the great place that it is, all the people who volunteer their time, their talents, their treasure to keep us going and to keep all of us going. It's a wonderful tribute, and that bear will always remind me of it. That bear reminded me of a few other things that I had in my memory and in my house that I thought I would share with you today, because I think we all have wonderful stories in our lives. We all have little items that we possess that remind us of beautiful things in our past and keep us going perhaps sometimes in our present. The person I want to talk about first is my friend Christian. Christian Mueller was his name, and Christian was a dancer on one of the cruise ships that I went out on. I used to spend part of my summer vacation from teaching high school as a priest by going out as a cruise ship chaplain, usually with the Holland America lines, but sometimes with other lines. And I would also devote some time to working with the United States Air Force. This one summer, I did go out on a cruise, and I really enjoyed the cruise, and one of the dancers was this guy, Christian. Well, we happened to have a policy on the ship that, unlike most cruise ships, the chaplain didn't go and eat with the passengers. This ship had it that the chaplain ate in the staff dining room. And so I'm in line at the staff dining room going in. It was a buffet at the time. I think we all remember buffets from back in the pre-COVID days. And we were getting in line, and I noticed that this dancer, Christian, was standing in front of me in line. And so I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, I really enjoyed the shows. They were a lot of fun, and you're really good at what you do, and I thank you for that. And he spun around and he said, who are you? And I explained that I was the chaplain on the ship. And he said, you want to sit together? And I said, sure. So we sat down and we had a nice conversation at dinner. In fact, at one point during the dinner, he got up to go and get something else, and he said, make sure you stay here, that you're here when I get back. And I said, I have no intention of going anywhere. Well, that began a lifelong friendship. We got talking with one another and enjoying it. And Christian went on to perform on many other cruise ships. One point he was up doing cruises in the Baltic area near Russia, and they were very, very poorly attended, I guess. But if they were long and drawn out, it was the same cruise every week, just a different group of passengers, but the same cruise. And he wrote me a letter and he said, I miss you. And I wrote back and I said, that's so really good. He said, yes. He said, it's the same thing day in and day out. It is so boring that I even miss you. And I always remembered that. It was probably a backhanded compliment. Christian went on when he got off the cruise ships to do some work in music videos. And probably the most famous one that I can recall is there was a singer by the name of Madonna. You might recall her. And she had a hit back in the 80s called Material Girl. To this day, if you go to the music video for Material Girl, that's my friend Christian. He's one of the dancers in the video. Actually, if you look at the video, he's the only blonde dancer among the people in that video. I used to tell my sophomores back in high school when I was teaching that I actually know someone who's performing with Madonna in her video, and they used to laugh at me and were sure I was making the story up. So one day I brought in a copy on a VHS tape, and I decided to show my sophomore class that this person is the person that I know, and I had pictures of me with Christian that I was going to show them after I showed them the video. Well, that day, the vice principal of the school decided to do a classroom inspection, and as I was showing the video of Madonna dancing in Material Girl with my friend in the video, the vice principal walked in, took one look at the screen, and turned around and walked out of my classroom with the comment, I'll talk with you later. No matter how much I explained that I really had a connection there, he didn't believe it either. Christian actually died in the early 1990s, and just before he died, he was hospitalized in Sherman Oaks, California. And I flew out to spend some time with him in the hospital. And it was kind of funny because we were still joking with one another and still fooling around with one another, even though we knew what was happening. And at one point, he would try to reach for something, and he was so weak he couldn't. So I would go and reach for it at his bedside and bring it to him or push it in closer to him. And he would look at me and say, stop that, I can do it myself. Stop that, I can do it myself. Well, at one point, he went to take a glass of very, very large glass of lemonade. And he took it and he dropped it. And he poured it all over himself in the hospital bed. So there he was sitting covered in lemonade in this hospital bed, and I just sat there. And he said, well, aren't you going to help me? I said, no, you can do it yourself. And we both laughed and cleaned up after that and went on. One of the things that I remember about Christian is he and I both shared a love for rather bright clothing. And after he died, one of his shirts came to me. And a friend of mine was in the business of making vestments for priests. And so he actually used the vestment to make up the design with Christian's shirt. So whenever you see me, if you ever see me wearing this vestment, you know that for me it's a very special occasion and it brings back wonderful memories. Christian and I actually almost went out hang gliding one night in San Diego. We decided that we were going to try this. Believe it or not, I was willing to go and try it. And so he and I went out, and you had to go to the edge of a cliff. And I didn't quite realize that. I kind of thought that they kind of pulled you along a little bit. What you actually did is you went to the edge of this cliff and you walked off it. And we both took a look at that and we both decided we really didn't want to go hang gliding. So we went out and got ice cream instead and went back to the house. But anyway, it's the story of my white vestment. Christian wasn't the only actor or dancer that I got to know in the course of my life. There was another guy by the name of Al Bandonis. And Bandonis is an unusual name. It's actually a Lithuanian name. So I was attending a show at the Shawnee Playhouse in Shawnee on Delaware out in the Poconos. And the play was Thoroughly Modern Millie. And one of the actors in the play I saw on the sheet, the cast list, was Al Bandonis. And I didn't know who he was, but I saw him in the play. And when I got back to New Jersey, I wrote him a note. And I said how much I enjoyed the play. And your name seems like it's a Lithuanian last name, and I'm Lithuanian. And I told him a little bit about myself, that I was a priest in New Jersey, and I was teaching high school, and I loved coming out to the Poconos. Well, about a week later at night, I get a phone call, and it was for me, and it was on a landline. I did not have a cell phone, and it was from Al Bandonis. It's about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and I'm talking with him, and I said, "Oh, you're so lucky to be out in the Poconos for the whole summer." And he said, "No, I'm not lucky." He said, "This is so incredibly boring." And he said, "I'd rather be in New York City. I could go out at night." He said, "Over here," he said, "there's nothing at night." He said, "You finish the show, you go back to your room." He said, "Even during the day, there's just a couple of restaurants. It's beautiful scenery, but there's nothing to do." He said, "I am so bored." Well, we talked for a while, and again he went back to this, "I am so bored." And I said to him, I said, "Al," I said, "this is ridiculous. You're in one of the most beautiful spots in the east coastern area of the United States, the Poconos. You're out in the beautiful mountains. You're performing at a beautiful playhouse." I said, "How bored could you be?" And he said, "It's 11 o'clock on a weekday night, and I am on the phone with a priest I hardly know." I said, "You win. You're bored." And we'll just leave it at that. Al was down in Florida now and still performing in some summer theaters and enjoying himself very much. There were other people I got to meet on cruises and on shows, and one time I got asked to do a comedy cruise. I wasn't the comedian, I was going as the chaplain, and it was a cruise out of California, and the two comedians who were headliners on the cruise were guys by the name of Frank Miles and John Prine. And I got to spend time with them because we were all three of us working the cruise. And actually neither one was Catholic, but both of them would occasionally pop in at my service. And the joke was, well, you come to our shows, we may as well come to your show. John Prine, you may remember, had a famous line. He was a very big comedian, actually made me look slim and small. And John Prine had a line where he would go into a Chinese all-you-can-eat buffet restaurant, and he'd be there, and he'd be thrown out. And the line was, he said, the owner would come over, look at me and say, "You go now, you here for hour, you leave." John Prine was just as funny at dinner, sitting at a table having a nice meal with me, as he was on stage, and certainly enjoyed seeing him. On another set of cruises, I got to meet a ventriloquist, young ventriloquist at the time, Todd Stockman. And Todd and I became friends. We got talking on the cruise, and for several summers, we went back to cruising at about the same time. I would go back to the Alaska run on the Noordam for Holland America as the chaplain, and he would be hired by the Noordam for the Alaska run as the entertainer, or one of the entertainers on the ships. And we got really to enjoy time with one another. He was friends with Shari Lewis. You might remember Shari Lewis and Lamb Chop, her little puppet. He also was friends with Kukla Fran and Ollie, that whole group from back in my past I remembered. The only annoying thing with Todd was he used to like to practice his ventriloquism, so even when we were sitting and talking to one another, he would not move his lips. I don't know if you can imagine how unnerving that is, to be having a conversation with somebody, to hear his voice, to be looking at his face, and yet not to be able to see him move his lips as he conversed. He kept saying, well, I have to keep practicing. I have to keep practicing. Todd did not enjoy cruise ships as much as I did. He did it basically because he needed it for work. I was doing it kind of as a vacation type thing, and Todd didn't like being out on the ships. Back then, they were starting a new show in New York, and the show was going to be called Titanic. It was going to be a Broadway play. It eventually did come on as a play and became a famous movie, but I belonged to a club in New York where you could go see previews of coming attractions. And they were trying to stir up interest in a play about the Titanic. And so I called Todd and said, you want to go with me? We're going to go out for the afternoon. We'll have dinner. And so he agreed. We go over to this show, and it was like seeing the whole story of the Titanic, only it was done without characters in costume, without settings. You were just hearing it read, and you were sitting there. And I had forgotten how much Todd did not enjoy cruise ships, and so we're watching, and they went through the scenes where eventually the Titanic was going down, and it was dragging on, and Todd turned to me and said, "Sink, darn ship, sink." I knew then that he really didn't enjoy the cruise ship life. Todd has the distinction of being the only person I've ever known who consistently called me Chuck. I was never Chuck when I was in school. Chuck to me was a piece of raw meat. I never used the nickname, and I never had it. I think part of the reason was because when I was growing up, there was another Charles in the neighborhood, and I got Charlie, and he got Chuck. And he was much more suited to the name. He was much more athletic and outgoing and sports-oriented than I was. So he fit. He kind of the crew cut type. But Todd always called me Chuck or Father Chuck. And so he has that distinction down to this day. And we enjoy it. He's been out to visit in Vegas sometimes. He's really a very active person, still in ventriloquism in New York City. Now, I thought about some things that I would have for show and tell that might involve people to whom I'm related, my parents. And one of the things that came to mind was this box. Now, it may not look like much. It's a dresser box, and it opens up and it has items inside it. But the key to the top of the dresser box is that it has my name on it, Charles B. Urnick. And it reminded me, there's a very interesting story, I think. When you're being confirmed in the Catholic Church, it was a custom that you would choose a name. It either could be you retake your baptismal name, or you take the name of another saint. And I was confirmed when I was in 7th grade, and my father had a dresser box somewhat similar to that, and it was emblazoned with his name, Charles Benedict Urnick. I think it came from the time when he was in the service. But that's why I chose Benedict as my confirmation name, so that I could have a box like that. That's been the whole reason. It was not a terribly religious reason, but it was a reason why I had it. So I've had the middle name Benedict ever since. And it's in honor of my father, of course, but it's basically there because of the box. And the box over the years, when I got my own as a dresser box, and it has the cross on it, and I put special things in there. I keep some of my Roman collars in there. I keep some of the items that have been important through life. So someday, when I have a chance, we're going to sit and we're going to go through the box, and I'll show you some of the funny items on the box. And then my mother, I have so many things from my mother that it was hard to single out some individual things. But there's one story that I wanted to tell, and it goes way, way back. In the 1930s, my father bought my mother a full-length beaver coat. Apparently, it was very expensive even back then, and back living in New Jersey, it was probably a very good idea to have a warm winter coat. But it was a full-length beaver coat from back in the late 1930s. Well, when I was born in 1948, Mom still had that coat, but the styles had changed going into the 50s, and so she had the beaver coat cut down to a 3/4 length jacket, and she wore that through the 1950s. When we got into the 1960s, that coat, that jacket 3/4 length, was out of style, and so she had it cut down to a beaver stole, and so she wore the beaver stole in the 1960s, and with some of the leftover beaver that was there, she had a hat made. Well, after Mom died, I was going through her things, and I found that I did have the hat, the beaver hat, and I dug a little further, and I do actually have the beaver stole. Now, I'm showing you this for a reason. Well, one, because I never throw anything out, but you probably knew that already. But the other reason is I'm trying to think of something I can do with that beaver stole to keep it in memory of my mother. I could hang it up, as I do now, on a hanger and keep it in the closet, but I'm wondering what things could be made out of that beaver stole that might be more visible or want to keep out in public view in memory of my mom. So any ideas on that, please make sure I get them, and I would love to have them. Now, I'm going to end this show with something that you probably do not expect at all from me, and that is a recipe. I'm going online and I happen to stumble on a cooking show. And one of the items they were making on the cooking show was a water pie. Water, W-A-T-E-R, pie. And it was apparently a popular dessert in the Great Depression back in the late 20s and 30s. And apparently the reason it was popular is because it did not involve using any eggs or any milk, items which apparently were scarce to get. It did involve things which the person doing it on the video said were common in every home. And so the only items that go into the pie are a pie shell, water, a little bit of sugar, vanilla, and flour. It's a very unusual recipe. You mix the sugar and the flour, and then you sprinkle them on top of the pie shell, which you have filled with water. And then you drop in a little bit of vanilla, and you put pats of butter over the top of it, and then you bake it. And after you've baked it for about an hour, you put it in the refrigerator and you chill it. And through some magic, it comes out like a shoe fly pie or a pecan pie, almost a custardly-like consistency. And there's no eggs and there's no milk. It's just unique. I'm actually going to print out that recipe and I will try to share it around because I think it must be really interesting and it's something I've never heard of, and maybe some of you remember hearing about a water pie from back in the Depression. Well, now it's time to see our owl here. Pascal's coming down and as usual has a message for us. I like these little messages. I think the Latin is kind of fun to look at and realize that some of the thoughts are common to us. And today's message is Amor Vincit Omnia. Amor Vincit Omnia. Love conquers all. Maybe that's a good life lesson for us. No matter what we're facing, no matter what we're going through, the power of love can conquer all things. Love of God, first of all, love of neighbor, and love of self. God bless you and have a wonderful week.